All of the things I have anxiety about and I'm terrified of, most of which are irrational for some reason, like writing the most humiliating and terrifying things about my life is not one of them. And I have no explanation for that. It was one of my first creative writing classes with the poet I, and she said, if when writing a poem you aren't made sick or brought to tears, it isn't a poem worth writing, which I think is very prescriptive and not always applicable. But it really moved me, that level of commitment to the power of the poem, and that she was willing to dedicate herself so completely in that way, with just in terms of like that emotional impact and how that could consume one's life. I didn't realize until I took I's class that that was a career option, poetry. I was at that point thinking more along the lines of journalism. So that was exciting, and that really changed my perspective. I think the hardest thing is resisting, like elevating it and resisting details that clutter what happened. I think most of what I do is trying to pare away at my memory to something that is meaningful to someone and still provides them with the information they need, but without distracting from whatever I feel like is the intent of what I'm writing. I think resolution is, it's tough because it can so easily fall flat. But like in terms of my narrative, I do feel that I arrived at some form of a resolution. So how do I express that in a way that's not cliched or didactic, in a way that's really true? I think I use landscape a lot, I use environment a lot. One of the first things that really struck me about Oklahoma was the landscape. And I don't know if it was that the landscape influenced me or that I sort of projected my mindset onto the landscape, or maybe a little bit of both. But I think like I use weather a lot, I use natural surroundings a lot to create like mood. And I think it's true to a certain extent, and then I think sometimes it's something that like my memory has placed on a moment. Not necessarily natural beauty, but the mood. This sort of starts out right after I got a concussion, which preceded sort of the worst period that I went through with depression, which certainly influenced that and was perhaps like maybe one of the biggest catalysts. So it starts out there and then kind of skips the climax and then move into sort of the slow recovery afterward. Spit, April 2008. When Zoe knocked on my dorm room door, I hadn't yet noticed the rain or had adrenaline at all that day, though it was midnight by then, because I'd been banned from riding any incline of heart rate. My professors on notice, still doubling with sunspins. I had been 3 weeks in the shade of that room. She told me, get a raincoat, some mud boots. The gates were all padlock shackled with highwaymen we'd heard roving to fill a kill pen. The barn at that hour was an altered dimension, the hitching rails empty where the herd would rotate through, bowline tied flank to flank, sun up till down, the brush hog cornered behind the concrete wash pad, dry as next week will be. Under the roof crush, Zoe said, you're sad, then made back into the pour for the south end pasture. We climbed to the top of the old split rail and sat. Black rain fell like spit on our chins that we didn't wipe off. I was glad for a discomfort of my choosing. I was glad the black was horizonless. A draft cross gelding came up from the bottomland after a while. Zoe climbed down and traversed him to the fence. I stood rickety from the plank and pushed a lead-weight boot over his back. My legs felt dwarfed and new, loose rubber on his bare slick sides. Zoe walked in circles, and he followed until he was bored with it. When we left, we kept our headlights off, the driveway a flood and filling. Closer to the dorm, my ears began ringing again. And though he was my favorite of the herd, when I leaned hard into my mind, like keeping mercury in my hands, I could not remember the gelding's name. Just the slow measured lumber in his back, the way the dark bled so we could be nothing or gods in it.
That's beautiful. I haven't heard that one.
Yeah, that one. The rest will all be repeats, but I wanted to throw something new in.
I love
it. The Country, August 2009. Coming back to Oklahoma in August, the sky was huge and backless, the way I had remembered it once. The sun bowled shadows on the blue stems, and the backside of range swells flashed oxblood bare. The grass above blown flat and curling over like a breaker. In town, the westerly sweep upturned the silver maple leaves like fingers run on velvet. In the apartment, I kept the windows open with the AC cranked. I burned everything I put in the oven. I cut off all my hair. I bought half a dozen slim ties, only stocked in white, and taught myself to dye them on the stove. There was water in the pool again, layered with leaves and dead crickets. But on a day when the heat pushed everywhere, like a tailpipe on my shins, I skimmed out what I could with a pail, made a place to step in, to hold the dog up to her chest, because for as hot as it got, she was always afraid to swim. Janine sent a series from New York in a hot pink box set, a show about LA dikes. I watched it until it felt less wrong to, and when I went places then, I knew I had a name. And somewhere in the country, which seemed nothing like the country I was in, I had a place where you could tell by a girl's fingernails. Guessing was a game. Terminal Lucidity, November 2008. In the first week of November, I got up on a morning and did not smoke. And that weekend, I did not drink. Every night I slept, every day I ate. I do not know why sometimes, when white varicose lingers long enough to read on grassland thunderheads, all the cattle lay down. Self-talk, May 2010. I walked home alone some nights in a skinny tie, my dyke hair, a pinball in hazy lit streets, blistering, cicadas tuning sloshed in my ears. Sometimes a breeze painted sweat cool in my hands, or was it tears, or was it that I couldn't really remember those walks home? All the cowboys who drove past in extended cab trucks, caked red with mud, would holler something, and I would double into myself like I could evaporate or disintegrate, like a blackout went both ways. And I wondered tonight if they would load that shotgun in their rear window rack, enter me the way they always offer to, the way they tell me I just don't know yet how I want it. And I tried to suppose why I made them so mad. What nerve I struck below that big belt buckle across the bar, 1 tequila, 2 tequila, 3. Tequila never really got old, and the heat felt like a cure for me. So I rarely looked sideways, never let in the way they looked at me, until faces became impressions or I couldn't see any. And I set off, and then a truck would pull out behind me, an engine revved, over a slurred voice stringing slurs at me. I never should have walked home alone, so I'd stare at my feet and try to walk straight and pretend I couldn't hear or see. And if they stayed long enough, I'd pretend to answer my phone, to tell no one that I should have never walked home alone. But I loved the heat, how it held me in shadowed green. Then I'd wake up and wonder how far they'd followed me, how long I'd keep showing up, tie naked and tequila declawed, let them stand in for what I still had left to say to me. I almost feel like the thing that I think about the most, and that I, especially recently, have really been trying to do is to like examine a moment and sort of de-dramatize it, because I think like the plainest way of presenting a moment, and like presenting the environment of a moment or the facts of a moment or the dialogue of a moment, I think the plainest way you can do that is ultimately the most powerful. I think a good reader is perceptive, and I think that they'll pick up on dramatizing, and I think it discredits what you're doing immediately. I think they check out a little. So I try to kind of trust the reader and let whatever feeling's going to happen within them, and not as much on the page. There are times when I'm writing where I believe my dramatization, and then I have to sit back and check myself, and I'm like, no, it wasn't quite like that. And at first, sometimes that feels disappointing, but then once it's on the page, it feels better. Like, it always feels more real. I feel like the biggest thing for me being here is having the time to work, and in having that time, allowing myself to make bolder revisions and to not worry so much about screwing things up. I think that probably I've done things here that I wouldn't have been brave enough to do otherwise, which is really exciting.